I'm just going to give you a quick brain dump of my view of the global food system and what needs to change. And a lot of this has been based on work that I have done over the summer for the Ministry of Defence think tank, DCDC, around thinking about the shape of the global food system and what it means from a security perspective. We need to think about food systems. For me, the food system is described on this diagram. Production of food goes into impacting some social environment, biophysical environment. It impacts the climate. The outputs go into some supply chain, especially in the rich part of the world, which allows us eventually to access the food. If we're in a poor part of the world, that supply chain might become very, very short without going through processing, packaging, transport, market, and retail, and so on. But ultimately, we end up choosing food, eating it. It impacts our nutrition, health, and our well-being, but our well-being is also impacted by the environment. And there are lots of feedback loops within a diagram such as this, including to waste. And one of the issues that I'm just going to be talking through is that I think we need to transform the food system because we, in a sense, have spent the last 20-30 years really investing in increasing agricultural efficiency, which is, really driving the growth in yields. And one of the impacts is that we have actually ended up with a food system that is hugely inefficient because it externalizes a very large amount of costs onto human health systems, onto environmental systems, and through waste. So if you look over the last 40 or 50 years where the data is available, the faster we grow yields, even faster we increase waste from the system. We have to think about a food system on a global basis because every single country's food system, even if they're relatively divorced from the market, is impacted by the global trade and global markets and so on. And this graph just shows that as global food prices go up, the food price index, where there is a red vertical line, there is some degree of civil unrest in different countries. And a lot of those countries you would think of as relatively isolated from global markets. And even if in a poor southern country, their only interaction with the global markets is in terms of food aid, that is going to affect local market prices and so on. So the global food system matters in many ways. Why does our food system have to change? Start off with health costs. If you look at where the bulk of our global calories are produced, it's in a relatively small set of breadbasket areas. Those produce a very large amount of output for the global food trade, and so over 50% of the world's crop calories comes from just this small handful of crops grown in a small handful of locations. And as a result of this concentration from our economic policy, the concentration of food production in food areas and few crops, then the whole global diet is becoming increasingly similar. And this graph in the bottom left is a statistical map of every dot is a country's diet at a point in time in statistical space. And where countries are similar, their dots are close together. Where they're dissimilar, their dots are far apart. And as you can see, the global food system has shrunk over time. All of our diets are becoming more of the same because we're eating more and more of the same crops. And as a result, it's very clear to see that the world is not becoming healthier from eating food. This pie chart here shows a mix of food groups that we should be eating according to one of the rich world healthy diet guidelines. This happens to be the United States. And if you look at what actually the world grows, you don't have to be a statistician to recognise that those two pie graphs are quite different in shape. The world does not grow the right mix of crops to make people healthy. And as a result, on a global basis, more and more people are suffering malnourishment in all its forms. We are reducing the number of people who are underweight because we have been really tackling this from a policy perspective for decades. But at the same time, we are increasing the people who are overweight and obese. And now under 50% or about 50% of the world's population are of an unhealthy weight. And this is feeding through into a whole range of different economic problems, clearly stunting and the familiar problems in the developing world. But in the developed world, poverty is often associated with access to obesogenic diet, one built on calories and not nutrition. And so poverty is often related to diabetes and the things that go with it, such as cardiovascular disease, a range of cancers, and so on. So malnutrition in all its forms is becoming a big driver of global health policy. Second reason we have to change is environmental costs. This set of figures is just if you take FAO data and effectively divide it by the number of people on the planet, then you end up with this set of statistics. One of the things that I find quite frightening about this is that for every person on the planet, 284 grams, that's 10 ounces of pesticide, active ingredient, is used. So it's not surprising then, associated with that, we have a crisis in biodiversity because this is having all sorts of negative impacts. And you're all familiar with the figures, about a quarter of the world's soils are degraded, huge amounts of biodiversity loss, antibiotic resistance is crossing into humans and becoming a real health problem, etc., etc., etc. From a climate perspective, when you look at the emissions that come from the agri-food system, then it amounts to about 30% of anthropogenic emissions, which is about the same as lighting, car use, air travel, washing machines, heating and cooling. And if you think about how the world is trying to tackle climate change, then inevitably there is going to be need to reduce this amount of greenhouse gases because we're reducing it in all of the other sectors. Third reason that our food system has to change is that it's at risk of breaking. If you look at this figure here of a map of boats have carried food across the oceans, you can see that there are a number of areas where there is critical infrastructure and choke points or bottlenecks through which large amounts of goods pass in a small area. And one of the issues associated with the change in climate and its impacts and the change of geopolitics and its impacts is how fragile our global transport system is to the way that things move around the oceans. One of the things that we're really starting to learn now that we hadn't really clocked until a few years ago is the evolution not just of the way average weather evolves. So if you look ahead to end of the century, then the central England temperature is projected to go up about 3.5 degrees at the moment, something like that, which would put us in a similar climatic regime to southern Spain. And we're kind of used to thinking of climate change like this, a gradual change that we can adapt to, even though it would be fairly a big climatic change. But if it's gradual enough, we can adapt to. But the thing that we're really getting to grips with now is that the evolution of extreme weather is going much faster than we used to think. Perhaps more importantly, it is the fact that extreme weather is often interconnected by major climatic patterns such as the jet stream, such that where you have bad conditions in one part of the world, you also have bad conditions in other parts of the world. And El Niño is a kind of case. Niño can be associated with very large perturbations to global food systems and global trade. And therein lies the risk as we drive ever more productivity growth from our food system to feed global demand. We are making our system really stretched to the point where it is close to breaking, degrading soils, losing biodiversity, etc. And then at the same time, the environment is becoming more volatile. Those two things are likely to interact. International agreements of the last few years imply that we have to change fairly radically. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know the Sustainable Development Goals are conflicting, in tension with each other, etc. But one of the high-level goals is starting for the first time to talk about sustainable consumption as well as sustainable production. Some recent modelling work has shown that one of the ways to optimise across the Sustainable Development Goals, so increasing 2 doesn't decrease 6, food versus water, for example, or increasing 2 doesn't increase the need to take climate action 2 versus 13. One of the ways of optimising across those modelling shows is to increase food prices. And through increasing food prices, you reduce waste, you reduce demand for land, you reduce impacts on health, you reduce demand for water, you reduce climate emissions, etc., etc. So food price is becoming a driver, or thinking about demand side is becoming a driver of dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the other area of recent policy action is the Paris Climate Agreement. And the Paris Climate Agreement implies two things. Firstly, it implies that we mitigate from agriculture. And the easiest way of mitigating from agriculture with perhaps a 5 times greater ability to mitigate is by changing our diets. particularly in the demand for livestock products on a global basis, rather than just changing our agricultural practice. And clearly we have to adapt agriculture as well, but changing demand as a means of mitigation. As we know, we are going to overshoot the carbon emissions for a 2-degree world at the moment, or a 1.5-degree world at least. It is likely that we're going to, towards the end of the century, have to claw back carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Clawing back carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is most likely to require large-scale use of land, and if we leave reducing carbon emissions further ahead than we are currently envisaging of becoming carbon neutral around 2050, if that drifts towards 2060 or 2070, we might need an area of, according to this graph, 8 million square kilometres of land for biomass energy carbon capture and storage. And that's about 60% of the arable area that we use at the moment. So Paris Climate Agreement implies that we're going to change our diets as a mitigating way of dealing with climate. And it also implies that we're going to have to give up quite a lot of land to use for climate action. The futures of food, where are we? On the one hand, we have our typical business as usual thinking, which is a vicious circle. The FAO food demand projections based on business as usual will drive our about demand growth. What will that do? We will increasingly eat more unhealthily, create more carbon emissions, lock us into dangerous climate change. That climate change will drive a reduction in yields, which will require us to intensify land use and extensify land use, and that will become that vicious circle that will end up in a very difficult place 2050 and beyond. And inevitably we won't meet the SDGs. Or the alternatively is that we can turn to a virtuous circle in terms of thinking about how do we supply diets that are nutritious, growing different things, wasting less, sustainably produced. If we had a food system that was 80% efficient rather than 40% efficient as it is now, we would free up a large amount of land. We could then do the climate action. So a sustainable diet for health produced in a way that was highly efficient could create this virtuous circle that we are happier, healthier, and dealing in a more sustainable planet. So then the question comes, how might that system transformation come about? Well, at the moment, we're kind of locked into business as usual thinking, driven by commodity crops and their subsidies and the trade liberalisation that the major governments in the world have really pushed. We can imagine ways that could change. So, for example, the World Economic Forum did a set of scenarios for the future last year or the year before, which is worth you having a look at to think about what a different food system might look like. If we don't change, then it is almost inevitable, as the climate costs mount and the healthcare costs mount, that geopolitical instability will also mount, and our globalised food system will become threatened, at least at some periods, and we'll have bigger food price spikes, and this will itself drive a breakdown of the food system that will force us to change. So what is the role of trade in this? You know, part of the reason that we have the problems that we have is because we see global trade as a public good driving down food prices, but it also drives the externalization of costs. It crowds out competitor crops from different areas, so we have this global bread basket, so the relatively small diversity of crops and so on. Whereas if we had a less global trade and more regional diversity, we'd have more stimulation of local markets. You could imagine more agricultural policy built around health needs and needs of local societies, and you could imagine quite a different situation. The future is almost inevitably going to be different. How is it going to play out? There are lots of scenarios in the literature about what it might look like, but the different futures have different implications for different technologies. They will imply different resilience to climate. They will imply different evolutions of climate. They will imply different food prices. I can't imagine a situation where food prices in the long run do not have to rise to reflect some of these health and environmental externalities and the way that supply and demand are increasingly going to come at loggerheads to each other. Conclusions. The past and the future will be radically different. Our current food system is globally unsustainable. I don't think anybody who works in this space disagrees with that statement. At the moment, I would not bet on business as usual trends carrying on for much more than a few more years before something major causes us to move in a different direction. Different technologies may or may not play a role. They're likely to play different roles in different places, and depending on whether or not markets become more regionalised or more globalised, we'll have different technologies that will be coming to the fore and different power structures as a result. And unless we change, inevitably, I think the risks of the food system breaking in a fairly catastrophic way will increase. So it then comes down to what food future do we want, and what can we as food system influencers and actors do to make the situation better and help to make the system resilient in the right sort of way, not resilient in the wrong sort of way, locking us into a bad future. But how can we transform the food system to one that delivers global health in a sustainable way rather than global in health in an unsustainable way? That's it from me.